Hi, Calvin, Talulah. This is your papa. I just wanted to read to you a little story so that you could watch it anytime you wanted to. This is from the book that I'm sending you called Myths and Legends. And it has a picture on the front of it of what looks like George and the dragon. So I thought I would read that story first. George and the Dragon. It's on page 162. So if you want to go ahead and flip to that page, you can follow right along with me. Okay? Enough is enough, declared the king. It's time to fight back. The crowd cheered and charged down to the lake. But a few moments later, they came charging back with a ferocious dragon hot on their heels. "Close the gate," they yelled, tumbling into the town. They were just in time. As the gate slammed shut, the dragon crashed against it. It was hungry and very, very angry. "Send out the sheep," shouted the king. The guards opened the gate just a little and pushed out two very frightened sheep. Bah! The dragon snatched them up one after the other. With two loud gulps, it swallowed them whole and then thundered away down the hill. Everyone breathed a huge sigh of relief, except the king's chief advisor, who was looking rather worried. He coughed nervously. "I'm afraid that was the last two sheep." There was silence. "You know what that means," said the king sadly. "There's nothing left for the dragon to eat. Tomorrow everyone's names will be put into a pot, and the person whose name is pulled out must be fed to the dragon." The very next day that was just what happened, and the day after, and the day after that. As long as the dragon had enough to eat, it left the rest of them alone. Then one day the princess's name was pulled out of the pot. The king turned pale. "Not my lovely daughter," he begged. "Take all my gold and silver, and even my entire kingdom, but please don't take my daughter." His people were furious. "This was your idea," they shouted. "We've given up our children to feed that monster. Why should you be any different?" The king was heartbroken, but he knew they were right. "Forgive me," he said, throwing his arms around the princess. Eventually, the king tore himself away and collapsed on the ground weeping. His people wept with him, for in spite of their anger, they all loved the princess too. The princess walked slowly through the crowd and made her way to the lake where the dragon lived. There she sat down all alone and waited, with tears trickling down her face. After a little while she heard the sound of hoofs, and a handsome knight rode up to her. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Is there something I can do to help?" "If you want to help yourself, you'd better leave now," sobbed the princess. The knight didn't move. "My name is George," he said, "and I'm not going anywhere until you tell me why you're crying." So the princess began to tell him all about the dragon, but before she had finished, she was interrupted by a terrible roar. The dragon reared up out of the lake and ran at them, his eyes blazing. George lowered his lance and charged. When the lance struck the dragon's chest, it splintered into 1,000 tiny pieces, for the dragon's heart was harder than any stone. As the dragon spun round in fury, its whip-like tail knocked George off his horse. Quickly he sprang to his feet and drew his sword. With all of his strength, he lunged at the dragon, but it hardly even seemed to notice. The dragon spread out its wings and took to the air. It circled 3 times, then swooped down, shooting flames from its mouth. It was almost upon them. When George saw his chance, beneath its wings was soft, pale flesh. Quickly he thrust his sword upward. The dragon let out a deafening shriek and tumbled to the ground. George rushed over to it. It was lying very still, but it was alive. He turned to the princess. "Give me your sash," he said. "Let's take the dragon back with us, so everyone can see that it won't hurt them any more." George tied the sash around the dragon's neck and tugged on it gently. With a groan, the beast lumbered to its feet. The princess gasped and shrank back, but the dragon hung its head meekly, and she saw to her surprise that it was no longer a threat. Together George and the princess led the dragon into the town. Everyone screamed and ran inside. "Don't worry," called George. "We've tamed it. Come and see." A few people peered around their doors. "He's right," exclaimed one man. "It's like a pet dog." "Whoever would have thought it," said the man's wife, shaking her head. Soon the whole town was out on the streets, clapping and cheering. The king heard the noise and came to see what was happening. "Oh, happiest of days!" he cried when he saw the princess. Sweeping her up in his arms, he hugged her until she could hardly breathe. At last he turned to George. "Brave knight," he said, "you've saved us all. Please name your reward." "Thank you," replied George. "Please don't think me rude, but I already have all that I need. I must leave now. There are others who need my help." And a moment later, he was gone. But the dragon stayed on in the town, living in the castle gardens. From then on, the only people who were afraid of it were the king's enemies. So it made the perfect guard dragon. And that is the story of George and the dragon.